host of Vanguardia, and I want to welcome you. This is a new program, a program that's going to be coming on weekly, focusing on Arizona Latino arts, politics, and culture primarily. We will dive into business issues from time to time and a broad range of subjects. It's hard to say where we'll go with the program, but this is a brand new program. It's going to be coming on weekly on Mondays, and we'd like to get started with my first guest. The first guest is Ana Flores. Ana is a local poet, originally from Phoenix. Went to high school at Carl Hayden High School, graduated from there. School made famous, many of you may know, because of the robotics program that they launched at that school a number of years ago. But she is living here in Phoenix, and living and working here in Phoenix, and also a practicing poet. And so I wanted to just kind of get to know her, talk to her a little bit about her background and where she plans to go with her career. So Ana, welcome first to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. So let's just get started with your what seems to be your primary passion these days. I know you have an acting background as well, but poetry, and poetry that is rooted here in Latino culture and in Arizona. Talk to me about, first of all, what you're doing in that world. And you have a book, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have a published book. I published it this year, actually, in the spring. It's called Pocha Theory. And I self-published it, and I launched it at ALAC, which is the Arizona Latino Arts and Cultural Center. But I've been involved with community since I was really young. I mean, I learned to dance folklorico at the Carl Hayden Community Center, and then I went to Carl Hayden and participated in walkouts and protests. So
has that inspired your
poetry?
Yeah,
definitely. So the poetry is about living as part of the immigrant community, although I'm not an immigrant myself. My parents are, and a lot of my family is mixed status. So that's what a lot of my grief in life has been about, and so that's sort of how I was coping with it, was through writing. And now it's evolved into a craft that I don't just do because I'm sad about the situation. But I went to school. I graduated from Arizona State with an English degree in literature and creative writing, and I met a lot of people there, a lot of poets, Rosemary Dombrowski, Alberto Rios, who have kind of inspired me to seek a career in writing. And
where do you think you began to gravitate towards poetry as an art form?
I think since I was really young. I remember being in second grade. Well, in Spanish, there's a lot of things called dichos, like metaphors. And my mom used to say, like, el que se enoja pierde, right? The one who gets mad loses. Yeah, and so I would make my own sayings that didn't make sense to, like, people in my class. I would be like, well, your dogs were in my backyard and the moon stopped shining. And, like... I just thought that's how people spoke.
And so you were writing, you were crafting words, yes, even at that early age.
Yeah, and then I realized that was a real thing. It wasn't just sayings from home. You could write them down, and it was really fun for me. And then I got into college, and I was writing poetry still, and I was taking poetry courses, but I wasn't writing about the border yet. I mean, I had a lot of poems that talked about the border here and there, and then my professor, Rosemary Dombrowski, said, you have a theme here. I didn't really want to write about the border because it wasn't like that appealing or fun. And then I started really writing every day, and I realized that that's what I wanted to talk about.
In my
writing
specifically, or
and most of my writing is about the border in some way.
But how do
you
define the border? I mean,
well, the border to me is just this really physical thing it's a political issue, but it's also the thing that separates my family. So a lot of the times I'm scared
and we aren't necessarily physically right on the border.
Right,
certainly
right.
We're part of that border culture.
But the border is everywhere. Yeah. I mean, the border dictates friendships, who you get to be friends with, who left in middle school, right? When the deportation started happening, what families left, how families look for work, or how people talk about labor. It's everywhere, and it's in all aspects of life. It's not just a security issue or a political issue. It's everywhere.
Is the work that you do as a poet, because I certainly hear some artists suggest that their work isn't political. Is the work that you do as a poet political?
Yeah, and I resented a lot of my mentors, a lot of my professors would tell me not to be political, or that being political was not the right way to write. But, and I understand that, because I mean, creatively, it isn't pretty on a page to write like SB 1070, you know. So like,
which was the Senate bill, immigration bill
right,
passed
right,
in 2010.
and so, but that is my natural language. I'm not reaching for that legislation talk or those 3-syllable words. That is just actually organically in my life, and so it is a natural part of how I speak, and so I don't think it's political when I write it. It is the truth. There's just no other word for it.
I guess part of the complication with some artists and people who comment on artists and the work they do is that political often gets defined in partisan terms, which obviously there's a lot of politics, and most politics perhaps isn't specifically partisan.
Right.
And then beyond that too, the idea that that somehow there exists art in the world that is not political, which strikes me as impossible as a playwright. It seems like every piece of art, no matter how bland and uninspiring, it has an underlying kind of political foundation of some sort, or link to the politics
and when
of the
your
culture.
life has been politicized, like, you can't really escape it. There's just no other way to say the things. There's no other way. There's no synonym for SB 1070. There's no synonym for mass deportation. I mean, you can try, but I think that would be doing too much. I don't think that would be very true.
Yeah, I was explaining to someone recently who's obviously much closer to my generation, and telling them that my first hint of political awareness was the resignation of Spiro Agnew, who was vice president to Richard Nixon at the time.
Okay.
And I was stunned as a kid by the fact that this vice president had resigned. And he resigned because he was accused of some crimes, right? Then, of course, President Nixon later resigned. But what was your, as you know, based on where you are now, of course, what was your sort of first awareness of kind of a political idea?
I think I'd always been aware of, like, language barrier, I think, was my first encounter with the fact that there were two different identities going on between me and my peers. I was maybe in like 3rd grade, but I would translate for my parents, and then very soon translate for two lawyers for my parents. So I talked to a lot of lawyers when I was very, very young, and so that's sort of.
And of course, at that age, you don't necessarily have the word political or
exactly
politicized in your,
right.
in your
it's
vocabulary,
just sort of a weird thing that that's happening. Don't really know why. And then, of course, in high school, the walkouts happened at my high school because of the legislation and
because of SB 1070.
and the mass deportations. And then that's when I realized that.
Now, when you sit to do your poetry, is there a conscious thought in your mind before you begin to write that there is going to be some political tinge to it, or in your is it something that simply comes out kind of organically?
I never. I mean, I am also, I think, politically aware, and I like to read articles about politics, and and I think that may bleed into the creative writing process. But I really read a lot about my family, and my family is heavily politicized in terms of what this country deems, what they're having to navigate, and it's continuous. So it happens. It just happens. But I when I read it to them, or when they read it, they don't think about the political background. They're just reading their truth.
It's sort of their family experience.
Yeah,
it's not
it's just
an commentary. It's just
right. But to somebody else who is reading it that may not know about mixed status families or immigrants narratives, it is a political thing. And especially when I'm in spaces where there's not a lot of people and I'm reading to people who don't really understand this sort of thing, to them it's like a political outcry, but that's not where the writing comes from. That's just kind of what it may sound like to some people.
Yeah, yeah, no, very good point. Have the politics of the last couple of years, obviously, much of which has revolved around this man in the White House.
Right.
Has that impinged itself now somehow on your creative work?
I
Not
think
necessarily
there's
him
I
as
think
an
there's
individual,
more.
but
I think
the
I
atmosphere.
definitely had a revelation about the power of arts because of this. And they say like when the government is bad, the art gets good or something like that. I heard something like that about the 60s. But I think
some of the best art in the world has come
Yeah.
from repressed communities,
right,
repressed
right.
societies.
And I think that may be because I feel like arts and politics both have the rhetorical ability to reach people, because except that the arts or poetry, specifically poetry, doesn't have an agenda, so both politics, a politician's speech and a poem has the same power to talk to people and to pierce through the intimate sphere, right? So we don't talk about illnesses, we don't talk about insurance, we don't talk about poverty unless there's a politician talking about how they're going to increase work and help people have more money, and then there's a poem that can also talk about poverty and break through that intimate sphere to try and problem solve. But I think that politics does a mistake of thinking that it needs to be indifferent in order to be successful, and poetry embraces empathy and compassion in the heart in order to problem solve. But I think that they're much more similar than we think they are.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. You're more than a poet. You're also an actress,
Right.
and you mentioned you have a dance background. Tell us a little bit about your acting work in the last
Yeah,
several
I
years.
mean, I'd been working.
And we can talk about this because we've worked together.
Yeah,
on this,
yeah.
But talk
With,
about how that's fit into your life.
New Carpet Theater, which you know.
Yeah.
I got involved with acting 6 years ago when I was
But
7
you were
years
acting
ago.
in high school.
Yeah, I was
That's
acting in
how-
high
that's
school.
how we
I
met.
liked acting, yeah. And even my high school was producing plays about the immigrant experience and about being a first generation student and crossing the border and all of these different things. So this story has always been in the background in one way or another. Even dance. I studied under Michelle Ceballos Micot, which, she's a neoclassical ballerina that embraces Aztec stories and narratives to dance, and
works with Guillermo Gomez Peña,
Right.
who has a lot of commentary
performance
about the
artist.
border
And then I teach folklorico at Central High School, which is a traditional Mexican dance,
Right.
but we make our own spin to it because we don't know the names of all
I was
this
going
stuff.
to say that folklorico somehow, in terms of what I know about you and poetry and so forth, seems like the most conventional kind of art
Yeah,
you do.
yeah, it is. It's the one that I definitely had to study more and abide by certain rules, because it's just a tradition, the most traditionalist type of art that I think I engage in.
Yeah. And why don't we just close out with what's next? I mean, where will you be going from here with your poetry or your theater, or what's?
I mean, I'm really...
And you should mention, of course, you are part of something called the New Carpet Collective.
Yeah, New Carpet Collective, which
Talk a
is a
little bit about
branch
that.
off of New Carpet Theater Company. Me and 5 other of my peers who have been acting with New Carpet Theater Company for a long time. We produce and we write and we do performance art, and it's all conscious and just trying to really dig into the stories that we don't hear in other theater companies in Arizona. And we really enjoy it, and we work with a lot of people that need a space and a platform.
And where are you staging the works? When you
We're staging works in Tempe right now at a space called La Basilica in Daniel's Plaza. But we also do a lot of work with ALAC, and we
The
share
Arizona
their
Latino Arts and
right. We
Cultural
share a
Center.
lot of space with them, and we do a lot of collaboration with them, and a lot of Arizona State students too. Especially Latino students, we work a lot with them.
And your poetry, where do you think you'll take it from here? You have the self-published book, Pocho Theory.
Yeah.
Pocha Theory.
Pocha Theory,
Yeah.
right. Well, I'm really intrigued by performance art, so I kind of want to see how I can take poems off the page and into performing. And then I might do an MFA at Arizona State. I think that's Natalie Diaz and Alberto Rios are very amazing poets nationally and internationally, so it'd be cool to try to have access to their teachings. But I'm just gonna keep writing.
Okay.
That's at least the most.
And
that I
we
do.
can't end the program without a little bit of a plug. We actually have a work that we're going to collaborate
Right.
on in May called Miranda's Curse, which is a adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Right.
And we have no idea what that's going to look like because not a word has been written yet. But it'll be a blend of theater and poetry. Obviously, capitalizing on Anna's skills and my work as a playwright. And it'll be in May at the Herberger Theater Center, the Cax Theater.
Right.
So please look out for that. Anna, I want to thank you so much for being here. It sounds like you have a lot of fantastic stuff on the table and great future ahead of you. It's been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you for coming to the show. Thank you for joining us on our first demo episode, if you will, of Vanguardia. This is going to be a weekly program that will be focused on primarily on Arizona Latino arts and politics and culture. And business news as well. And we'll have a whole variety of guests in the coming weeks. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today.